Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Infosecurity magazine interview. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Dave Stapleton from ProcessUnity, who is their CISO and VP of Security Operations. And today we're going to be talking about a data-led approach to third-party risk management. Now, Dave, organizations have tons of third parties and vendors they work with, and they pose a significant security risk to many organizations. From your point of view, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that companies are facing today when it comes to those third parties that they are working with?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. In answer to your question, I think maybe a way to organize it is to think about the different personas or perspectives. So typically, when we talk about third-party risk management, we have the kind of customer or consumer perspective, and those of us who are using third parties to do different things. And then we have the third parties themselves, and both of them come into play here. I think for context, as you mentioned, there is just a volume challenge where there's an increasing volume of third parties that are being used by organizations around the world. Some of our smaller customers within ProcessUnity still have hundreds of third parties that they're leveraging and depending on and need to manage the risk of. And then, our larger Fortune 10 customers have tens of thousands of third parties. So it's just a volume challenge for sure. There's also this increased dependency on our third parties. I think we give them more and more sensitive data. We're depending on them for more critical use cases, and we're leveraging them for specific kinds of business outcomes that are really critical to the success of our business. So there's that increased dependency as well. And then we have complicated relationships with our vendors. They're doing more things, more kind of intricate ways that they're connecting to us, to our environments, to our data, to our customers. And sometimes it's difficult to understand the inherent risk, if you will, around how we're using a third party and how they might impact us. I give an example that, at the beginning of the year, I wonder who was doing their, business impact analysis on third parties and had a bad CrowdStrike update taking down Windows servers around the world as a likely third party risk scenario. Probably not a lot. So it's just kind of complicated. And what I think all that does is requires a lot of effort, a lot of resources to try to manage the risk. And unfortunately, we oftentimes have limited third-party risk management resources. It's not always easy to get the investment for third-party risk management. So from the customer perspective, there's the increased dependency, the increased volume, kind of rapidly changing threat landscape as technology changes, these complicated relationships, and in some cases, limited resources to sort of manage all of that. From the third-party perspective, I think the major challenge is just the volume of questionnaires that come in. There's so many of them. Oftentimes I'm on the receiving end of this, so I know it pretty well firsthand. They can feel repetitive. They can feel like they're taking you away from more valuable work. And there can just be so many of them. So I think that's from both the customer and the third party perspective. Those are some of the challenges to set some context.
Yeah, and questionnaires is definitely something we're going to pick up on a little bit later. And I wanted to just pull a quick stat for our viewers as well. And this is something ProcessUnity had included in a white paper you recently did. And that is, and I'm going to read it to just make sure I get it right. Forrester had done some analysis and found that just 30% of organizations said that their company's third-party risk management program evaluates at least half of existing third-party relationships. So from that, we can deduce that most third-party relationships are going unevaluated. So Dave, from a point of view of traditional third-party risk management programs, what are some of the biggest issues?
Well, I mean, all of the things that I just mentioned, I think typically apply in the traditional sense. But there's a few other things I'll highlight. I think one of them is static questionnaires. As you mentioned, we'll talk more about them later. But this, the idea of just the static questionnaire being the only point of reference, the only way that we collect data, it's just simply not dynamic enough. It's not current enough. Cybersecurity happens fast. New threats, technology evolution, that's all happening quite quickly. So, for example, if you're using the same set of questions for third-party risk management that you were using 5 years ago, you're probably not adequately covering things like AI-related risks in your questionnaire. And you're only getting that information, maybe once a year or once every 2 years, depending on how often you're assessing a particular third party. So I think that's one of the traditional challenges. Also, traditionally, we tend to be very manual in how we manage third parties. We use spreadsheets or PDF documents, things like that. We're emailing them to our third parties, and we're spending a significant amount of time chasing down those assessments, trying to get them completed and returned to us. All that's very time consuming and error prone. And then the last one I'll mention is this lack of like a program wide visibility with relation to third party risk management. We have a bunch of flat files, spreadsheets and PDFs that I mentioned in various folders. And that makes analysis kind of challenging on an organizational level. You can't really see the forest for the trees in that kind of a situation. So I think the static nature of questionnaires, the manual processes, and that lack of sort of a program-wide visibility are three of the major issues surrounding the traditional third-party risk management.
So we've kind of got the lay of the land there, and we won't dwell too much on all the challenges and pivot towards focusing on some of the solutions and what we can actually do to start tackling some of these issues. And I know one of the things that ProcessUnity advocates for is a risk exchange. So can you describe kind of what that is and how that starts to tackle some of those challenges that you've described there?
So I'll give my own personal kind of basic high level description of a risk exchange. I like to think of it as a central repository, a database, if you will, of risk data about third parties from around the world. Risk data that we're talking about here is added to the exchange by the third parties themselves, as well as from other sources like risk ratings, scans, or outside-in scanning, threat intelligence monitoring services, that kind of thing. All that data gets collected in this exchange, and it gets standardized against a framework. And the framework is, basically a list of security controls, like you might see in NIST 853, is a pretty ubiquitous one that a lot of people will be familiar with. And what makes it an exchange is that multiple different customers of a particular third party can access that same collection of data about that third party that exists on the exchange. So there's kind of a one-to-many characteristic that I think makes it into the exchange. And there's a lot of things that come out of that I'll get into. So that's my quick definition of an exchange. I'll say that ProcessUnity has the largest third-party risk exchange in the world. And so I can give a few examples of how the way that we've developed our exchange does resolve or address some of those challenges we talked about. The first big one is something I like to call collective demand. And I maybe just coined that phrase just now, but there's a lot of benefits that come from that collective demand that the exchange creates. Traditionally, you're going to be sending questionnaires to your third party, and it's up to you to engage them to complete and return the questionnaires. In an exchange, there are many customers asking the third party to provide this data. And because of that, and because the data is standardized, those requests really appear to be like one request from the third party's perspective. So that speeds up the response times for any kind of risk data that you're requesting from the third party themselves. Also, due to the collective demand, and the years of growth of our exchange, when many of our customers first join us, they realize that a significant percentage of their third parties are already on the exchange. They're already participating actively. And those third parties' risk profiles are really just a few clicks away. They have to get authorized to be able to see the data, of course, but it can happen very, very rapidly. So again, that's far faster than sending a questionnaire, waiting around or harassing the third party to get it sent back to you and performing that analysis. Instead, you can sometimes get that information within minutes. And then one additional benefit of that collective demand, I think, is when we have what I'll call kind of traditionally hard to assess third parties, those companies have an incentive to participate in an exchange. If you were to send a spreadsheet to, let's say, Microsoft, there's about a 0% chance that they're even going to look at it. But Microsoft is an active third party on our global risk exchange because they're able to satisfy the requirements of so many of their customers via this one process. So you're able to assess kind of previously hard to or impossible to evaluate third parties. And then one other challenge that I mentioned was this lack of portfolio-wide visibility. And I think the standardization of the data that's in the exchange is really important for that, because it lets us look across the whole inventory of third parties that we have and really compare apples to apples. We can identify trends, see hotspots that need particular attention. We can produce executive reporting about the success or effectiveness of our third-party risk management program with the click of a button. So I think those are a few examples of how an exchange can solve some of those traditional problems.
Yeah, I think that's really clear as well, that kind of collective demand that you described. Um, with the amount of data that's going into this, it sounds like it is ripe for our favorite kind of buzzword at the moment, which is AI and machine learning. How does that fit in? How does AI fit into the risk exchange, and how does it kind of make processes simpler? Because you've kind of described a landscape of a lot of questionnaires and a lot of data. So for people that have got a huge amount of vendors, what is the kind of AI element in this risk exchange doing?
I'll give you two examples of how AI is being leveraged currently, and then I'll maybe tease one that I hope is coming soon. So one of the key processes in any kind of third-party risk management program is measuring inherent risk. I think I mentioned that before, and how that's associated with each of our third parties. It's basically understanding across a set of domains how much of an impact a third party could have on us as their customer, almost kind of like a worst case scenario type evaluation. And doing that evaluation can require a lot of resources. So you need business unit input on how your organization is engaging with a third party. What does that relationship look like? What data or internal access is being provided to that third party? How quickly you could pivot to an alternate vendor, if needed. All these types of questions need to be answered in order to really measure inherent risk. And inherent risk is what tells us, how rigorous our assessment of the third party needs to be. So all that input around the inherent risk score, which is kind of almost step one after knowing who the third party is, can take a lot of time. However, as you mentioned, on an exchange with hundreds of companies that have answered those inherent risk questions about third parties over and over again, we can start to use statistical analysis to predict the inherent risk between any company and any vendor. And that's a massive time savings. If you come onto the platform, you haven't done this yet, and you can just, again, with a click of a button, at least have a high confidence prediction of what that inherent risk is supposed to be. And it starts to let you know, all right, I've got these pockets of, critical or high inherent risk. I've got these other ones that are kind of low inherent risk. I don't need to do as much for those. So that's one example that can happen very quickly out of the box by combining just the volume of data with that kind of statistical analysis. As I mentioned, also, one of the core tenets of the exchange is the standardization of the data. And because of that, if the exchange reaches this certain volume of information, our data scientists could say a lot more about what that means mathematically. You can develop a machine learning model that can predict how any third party would answer their assessment on the exchange. Again, because it's all standardized and we have so many examples. So the data that the model learns from is the attested risk information that's provided by thousands of third parties themselves who have come onto the exchange and completed assessments, combined with hundreds of points of firmographic information. So examples of that would be things like the industry of the third parties who are completing assessments, their revenue information, geographic location, that type of thing. So for rapid business decisions that really cannot wait for an assessment in a more traditional way, this is really a game changer. It means that effectively from day one of joining an exchange, you can have 100% coverage of all your third parties, which is I think statistic from Forrester that you mentioned earlier is huge. You'll have the risk data from various different sources that includes these kind of like high confidence predictions from AI if an actual completed assessment isn't already available on the exchange. And it sort of gives your analysts a bit of precognition, to use a sci-fi term, of potential hotspots to look for. They can see in advance, this third party, I'm going to want to probably dig a little deeper around, access controls, because I'm seeing that this prediction is saying that that's an area where they're going to be a little lower in their effectiveness. So I think those are two areas that are happening like right now, absolutely 100% in the exchange platforms as we speak. What I'm looking forward to in the future from that third party perspective, because again, I feel that pain from time to time myself, is the ability to provide very easy to gather information, process documents, policies, standards, previously completed assessments, things like that, and have the platform use those, plus some AI to kind of pre-fill my assessment. Just take a lot of the load off of me, so I still have to go in and review and make sure everything is accurate, but I'm not starting totally from scratch. And I think that'd be a really big game changer for the third party. So yeah, I'm excited about the ways we're using and will be using AI for third party risk management.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of logical place for AI to sit and be used in those case studies that you've kind of explained there. And you talked a bit there at the end about the potential benefit for third parties being part of the platform. And this is a two-way street. Any third-party risk management program, you've got the organization and the supplier. So, what is the incentive for a supplier? And as you said, you've got a bit of experience with this in terms of being part of the platform, and how do organizations encourage their suppliers to kind of join and get on board?
So the most obvious one is kind of what I've mentioned before, and that's the reduced number of security questionnaires that you have to complete. I like to try to make it a little bit more practical. So for simple math, because I'm not that great at math, let's say that on average, your company completes 100 questionnaires a year, and it takes you 10 hours to complete each of those. So you spend 1,000 hours a year just answering questionnaires. Even if 20% of your customers accept this risk profile that you've built on the exchange, that's a pretty significant impact. I mean, think what you can do getting 200 hours back. That's 5 weeks of manpower that's back into your security program that you can use for, really implementing and monitoring new, more effective security controls, which ultimately is what we want to be spending our time doing on the security team. So I think that's the big one. That's the obvious one, is just reducing the level of effort and the resources required to respond to kind of the more traditional way that we get assessed individually by each of our customers. And then also, I think if I put my sales hat on, it's a much faster way to satisfy kind of pre-sales due diligence or prospects that have requests that want to know more about our security program before maybe they sign up and sign a contract with us as an organization. And that's increasingly becoming a more critical and necessary piece of that pre-sales process. So as a third party, I can log into the exchange, enter a recipient's email address, and click share, and send them an invite to view my risk profile in less than a minute. So that makes our sales teams really happy, which also makes me very happy as well. So I think those are two really big benefits for the third parties.
Yeah, it's certainly the case that customers are demanding more from suppliers when it comes to security, data privacy. So if there is that kind of one-click thing that you can take a look at and say, well, yeah, you would fit in with our security requirements, it doesn't seem like too much of a barrier to sell, then for the vendors, that's an incentive to definitely be part of that. So if we take a step back to look at the end user, the organizations that are saying, right, we're going to use a risk exchange, do you approach every single third party and say you need to be part of this? How does that work? Is it also like one size fits all, everyone needs to be part of it? Do you prioritize it? How does that work? Because an organization that's got 10,000, 30,000, and some do, vendors or suppliers, how do they go about that from the start?
I mean, when you're first getting started, I think it makes a lot of sense from a best practice perspective to prioritize your highest risk vendors. I talked about inherent risk beforehand, and that's usually the method that we use to determine, how deeply, how granular we want to get with the assessment process. And so my recommendation would be, if you can't just kind of go all in with all of your third parties, at the very least start with those most critical vendors that have the highest likelihood to have the biggest impact on your organization. So certainly I would kind of use inherent risk as a guide if not everything can be put in. I'll make a comment about that real quickly though. One of the things that's cool about a risk exchange is you don't necessarily have to apply that same level of rigor across all of the third parties in your portfolio. So, for example, let's say I'm new on an exchange. I can add 1,000 of my third parties, maybe that's all of them that I have, and say, well, for these 50, we're going to go down this path that includes quite a bit of assessment and evaluation. And for these other ones, we have different sort of levels of assessment. Maybe there's a whole chunk at the lower end where I'm not going to really do anything. I'm just going to monitor the signals that are coming in from the exchange, the scanning that's happening, the threat intelligence monitoring, that sort of stuff. So I think the inherent risk really informs that decision. But also, as previously mentioned, if you have any third parties that you really haven't been able to sort of crack the code on and be able to get in and to assess, oftentimes they're the really big vendors that have just exceedingly large numbers of customers and are pretty resistant to doing any kind of individual assessment, that's sort of given you the cold shoulder in the past. I would absolutely include those, because there's a much higher likelihood that they're going to, if they haven't already, they will see the value in using the exchange, and you might get to explore and assess them in some ways that you haven't been able to do before.
To go back to what we were maybe talking about a little bit at the beginning, questionnaires. That's kind of been a theme throughout this conversation. Is a pain point, but also within this risk exchange, you've got a solution to make those simpler. Can you just describe a little bit about how they work within the risk exchange? Who's able to view them? How they're supported?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I'll say about the questionnaires is, in order for them to provide maximum value in an exchange, it's that standardization that I mentioned before that's key. That enables everything. It's the portfolio-wide analysis, the benchmarking capabilities. It speeds up the individual third-party risk analysis. When every time I look at this, these are the areas, this is how it's formatted, this is how it's laid out, this is what I can see. I can even stack third parties side by side and kind of evaluate them. That standardization does all of that. Plus, it enables the AI and the more programmatic and analytics functions that I was describing earlier. So the big thing around the questionnaires in the exchange is they've got to be standardized. I'll take a moment and mention that questionnaires are not the whole answer. There is no one size fits all questionnaire that will satisfy every possible scenario. So a couple of examples of that are, in many cases, particularly with our more risky vendors, we're going to want to supplement the questionnaire with other types of testing or evaluation. So things like penetration tests. That's a different objective than your objective with sending a questionnaire. There's different testing techniques that go on there that's trying to evaluate a different kind of risk. So that's something that is always going to stand alone, and you're never going to be able to include in a questionnaire type of a process. Some organizations also have pretty specific or niche compliance requirements, based on industry standards or regulations. So like PCI DSS is around, do I give my vendor payment card information? You don't need to ask every single one of your vendors about, physical security controls for point of sale devices. It's probably not applicable. But in some cases you do. Industrial control systems have particular standards you would have to ask about, and even privacy regulations. While there are some general principles that are always included in questionnaires, there can be, based on location and other types of things, maybe like protected health information, for example, very specific questions that need to be asked that aren't just going to be in your standard questionnaire. And as I mentioned before, questionnaires can be pretty point in time. So the other thing to think about supplementing them with is those sort of real-time or continuous monitoring solutions, the risk ratings, outside-in scan data, the threat monitoring services, that type of a thing, that keep the data fresh about the third party when you're sort of in the middle of a cycle, in between assessments, utilizing something like a questionnaire.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think that's given, hopefully, anyone watching some real insights into what a risk exchange does, the benefits it brings to both the organization as well as the third parties as well. For anyone that's thinking, okay, right, how do I go from that organization that maybe doesn't have complete visibility over all of my third parties to leveraging a risk exchange? What would be your kind of top tips for getting started, working with a risk exchange, getting on that program?
Well, I think I give this every time this kind of a question comes up, regardless if it's about starting with third-party risk management wholesale or getting started with an exchange. I always have the first thing, because it seems to be missed more often than I would expect, and that is that you have to know who your third parties are. before you can really start to implement an effective third-party risk management program, whether you're using an exchange or not. So that's always the first step. It's super critical. Something that tends to be missed is organizations will spend incredible amount of resources to kind of develop this initial inventory. So they've got it all sorted out. It's accurate. Everything's up to date, but they have no process in place to keep it accurate and updated. So, onboarding new vendors, making sure that, they're properly vetted or, added to this list. And then offboarding, what happens when you stop using a particular, SaaS vendor or something like that? How do you make sure that that's updated as well? So that's always step one for me as far as tips related to third-party risk management. When it comes to an exchange, I would say I'd be looking for an exchange with the highest volume of quality risk data on as many third parties as possible. So, as your company grows, you'll benefit from the most when new third parties that you start to engage with and you decide to use are already active participants of the exchange. So I'm looking for just not just lots of data, but lots of quality data in an exchange. And related to that, one of my first questions would be to perform some kind of like a matching analysis between my third-party portfolio and the third-party data that's available on the exchange. What I would want to see is, somewhere like 25 to 40% match, where I know that on day one, when I enter the exchange and start to, become a customer and start to use it, 25 to 40% of my vendors, hopefully more of the higher inherent risk vendors are already there and already actively participating, providing information, and working with their other customers on the exchange. And then I would look at how the exchange is leveraging technology. We talked about AI before. Are they really just like a glorified shared drive that's hosted in the cloud? That's not much of an exchange. Or are they really innovating to make my life and the life of my vendors easier and more productive? So, I think if you find a provider that has the data you need and is empowering your risk management teams with the latest advancements and value adding technology, then you're off to a really good start.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. I hope that's given anyone that's watching a bit of a starting point, or maybe areas where they can enhance their existing third-party risk management program. But once again, thank you, Dave, for going through all of that with me, and for ProcessUnity for supporting this interview. If you want to find out more about risk exchanges and third-party risk management, do head to the ProcessUnity website. There will also be some information and links in the notes below this interview. But with that, thank you everyone for watching. And don't forget, you can always head to infosecurity magazine.com for more information on the latest cybersecurity topics.